Put it down for now. Mark, these are yours to hand out.
Wondering about that.
Sorry for the slight delay. I would like to call to order the regular meeting of the City of Sonoma Planning Commission for Thursday, July 12th, and may I have the call to order, please?
Commissioner Barnett.
Here.
Commissioner Jansen. Here. Commissioner Willander. Here. Chair Felder.
Here?
Commissioner Bohar.
Here.
And Commissioner Cribb.
Here.
And may I ask Commissioner Cribb to lead us in the pledge, please?
Flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
How many are there? Just a matter of housekeeping. If anyone has cell phones, please turn them to silent mode so they don't disturb us during the meeting. And I don't believe we have an agenda that will stretch beyond 10:30, but if it does, we need a majority vote to continue by the commission, or we'll have to postpone the item to another time. And with that, we are in the section of the meeting for comments from the public. This is for items not appearing on the agenda, and please limit your comments to 3 minutes or less, and state your name and address.
Good evening, Commission and staff. My name is Fred Allebach at 19550 8th Street East. And I always enjoy the national anthem because I have a brief moment of feeling like I'm on the same team with everybody, so that's kind of a nice feeling. And I'd just like to make a few words about coming to the Planning Commission and getting to know David Goodison over the years, because I know that he's leaving. And so when I first started out in town, Montini Dogs was my first big thing, and I had no idea what an initial study was or anything. And David said, "Here's the initial study." I'm like, "Oh, what's that?" And so gradually over the years, I've really come to admire David's command of the issues and want to emulate his his command of all the different terms and how to frame things. So it's been really fun, and I've enjoyed the city government process as a citizen. And so I just wanted to say that I admire David, and I'm sad to see him go, but I know he's going to have a good time wherever he's at.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else?
Good evening, Commissioners and City staff. My name is Lynn Marie DeVincent, 65 Guadalajara. I'm here to speak about the applications for the Verizon close proximity microwave radiation antennas that are under review and scheduled for your August 9th agenda. I've been doing community outreach for my Sonoma neighbors in alliance with My Street, My Choice statewide networking organization. I encourage all of you to make use of this website that includes a survey form so that we can hear our neighbors' concerns and opinions. It's aptly named. This is my street. I'm a tax-paying voting stakeholder in this city, and it is my choice, it is our choice to keep our neighborhoods healthy and safe. This Verizon so-called small cell project requires a huge learning curve, and one of the essential tasks is informing the community of what is happening. I've been working on this for 3 months and have not felt that the city is doing its due diligence. I went to the CBR Verizon open house recently and witnessed their failed attempts to educate our community. I made myself available to present the community position on these invasive installations, but not one person showed up due to their incompetent publicizing of this meeting. A much more effective idea is to hold a town hall meeting, as you did with the cannabis topic, so that the community spokespersons can have equal time to the Verizon salespersons. Santa Rosa held a special council study session, and Napa is planning a public workshop for their communities, and Sonoma should do the same. The other essential job for the city is to post notices on the poles at the 10 locations so that the nearby homeowners and businesses can see and realize that they may have one of these toxic microwave radiating cell units next to them radiating 24/7. So far, only the 3 commercial poles have been tagged, and we need the other 7 to be tagged immediately. I understand that with the resignation of the senior planner in June and the well-deserved retirement of Mr. Goodison, the planning department is stretched thin. I would like to volunteer to post on the remaining polls tomorrow. If that is okay with the commissioners, we would like to use our own yellow information flyers, so let me know if that is permissible. And for the public record, I would like to present these images that show a good representation of the massive size and of these units. Oh, thank you. There you go. This is what they look like. Small cell. So.
How high are the poles?
Anyway,
We need
yeah,
to
I have to
Keep
stay
the
focused
comments
here.
to the
Commission.
commission, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I just have a few seconds left. Again, please go to the website, My Street, My Choice, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Ask if it's okay, I guess.
We have, or I have, but we have about 1.5 minutes of video and audio to share, and then I have a few words afterwards.
Well,
Is that
let's
okay?
take a pause here. It is currently the policy of the City Council and Planning Commission to only accept public comment and not videos during this period where it's for items not appearing on the agenda. But I would be happy to take a straw poll of the commission to see if they want to entertain a video or not. So at this
The
point,
Verizon CEO talking directly to you. It'd be good to hear.
well,
We'd appreciate it
I
if you could.
appreciate you doing that, but I will take a straw poll at this time. So anyone on the commission that would like to hear the video as part of this public comment, I would ask for your affirmation.
I have no problem with it.
It's 1.5 minutes.
Yeah.
My only issue, I would love to watch it. I mean, don't have an issue with it. I don't want to set a precedent where video public comment is now, common. And so that's just my concern. I don't care either way.
High goes the runner.
I think, I don't want to set a precedent either, and I think if
they wish to share it with us, like many other people have done, they can certainly email the link to it or whatever prior to the meeting. I just think that would be more appropriate during the discussion of that item. If they have some information to share, then I think they should do it in the traditional form of a public comment.
Which
We-
I believe they did. They emailed us the link, right?
Yes.
Did you email us?
Yes, we
Right.
did.
But everybody else doesn't get a chance to see it.
Sir,
Yeah.
the commission is having their discussion right now,
Yes,
please.
please, wait till we finish.
In light of the fact that it's going to be agendized next month with a full presentation, I personally don't see a real benefit of seeing it tonight. I'll just would fold that into my normal preparation for the a normal agendized item, so not.
Just a straw poll, so all those in favor of hearing the video, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
Nay. So I'm sorry, you won't be able to show the video tonight.
Okay, well,
So you
I'm
then
sorry.
have 3 minutes to speak.
I would read these things. At least read that. Verizon quote.
okay, my name is Mark Marthaler. I'm a resident Sonoma on East Spain Street. I've been up here a couple of other times, and I'm learning my public speaking, developing my skills as I go along, so bear with me. I'm here representing, again, about, I've been able to talk to about 150 people so far between now and when I became aware of this issue. No one likes it, and no one wants it. So the video that we were going to show is the Verizon CEO disclosing some very interesting information. And I'll just read this quote. Lowell McAdam, CEO of Verizon, just recently. When Verizon went out in these 11 5G test markets, we tested for well over a year so we could see every part of foliage and every storm that went through. We have now busted the myth that 5G frequencies have to be line of sight. They do not. We busted the myth that foliage will shut 5G down. That does not happen. And the 200 feet from a home, we are now designing the network for over 2,000 feet from transmitter to receiver, which has a huge impact on our capital need going forward. Those myths have disappeared. Contradicts, that's the end of the quote, it contradicts their presentation thus far. Jason L., Verizon field engineer, says, quote, Verizon 5G is really high frequency, 28,000 megahertz and 39,000 megahertz. So everybody thinks it doesn't go very far, but it's really big pipe, and that's what allows you to gain the super fast speeds. We're 3,000 feet away from our radio node. The cool thing about this is that we did not move the radio node. It's pointing down to serve the customers in that area. Here, even 3,000 feet away, we're still getting 1,000 megabytes per second speeds. So now we've driven about 1/3 of a mile away from the radio node. We are still getting very good speeds, even though we have foliage in between. So my last statement is, after that, I would like to talk about the duty of each of you with respect, that each of you will have in 1 month regarding your decision to approve or deny Verizon's applications to place and construct in Sonoma 3 to 10 unnecessary close proximity microwave radiation antenna, wireless telecommunication facilities. Unnecessary because we just heard the CEO of Verizon, as I quoted, say on video that 4G, 5G antennas can be placed 2,000 feet or farther from homes on macro towers, just like the ones we already have in Sonoma, and still provide coverage.
Thank you, your time is up.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. My name is Paul McGavin. I understand from watching videos from recent Sonoma Planning Commission and City Council meetings and from reading documents in the public record that each of you are now aware that the City of Sonoma, a corporation, is potentially colluding with a variety of wireless carriers and their agents to systematically cancel the rights of Sonoma residents. The actions or inactions that the Sonoma City staff and you planning commissioners will take over the next month will demonstrate if the city of Sonoma will remain complicit in this negligence, which therefore would be evidence of an explicit strategy. You have each been informed in the public record that the 2014 FCC rules and the 2015 California Assembly Bill 57 formalized a 150-day shot clock that governs Sonoma's need to process applications for new wireless telecommunications facilities. The city of Sonoma is blatantly ignoring their duties under these laws and providing no assurances to Sonoma residents that the city is doing anything to right the ship. All of the shot clocks have already run. That's our problem. So what do we need? We need actually a letter, not a statement. We've heard statements like, quote, the applicant has not invoked the shot clock, end quote. That's meaningless unless there is a signed shot clock tolling agreement similar to the one I emailed to you this afternoon. That is an agreement executed between Sebastopol and Verizon agreeing a mutually agreed to end date that's beyond the public process. We're not there. The end date has passed. Therefore, any public process is a farce unless you execute such a letter. Democracy requires in the next 2 weeks such shot clock tolling agreement letters, must be executed for each of the 10 Verizon applications. Otherwise, Verizon holds an unjust trump card against any legal challenge to these unnecessary installations of close proximity microwave radiation antennas that are going to be 15 to 50 feet from residents' homes. Completely unnecessary because they go 2,000 feet or more. Without these letters executed and entered into the public record, Verizon could invoke the shot clock at any time. In fact, they will do it as a summary judgment. The very first time someone tries to enforce their rights to protect their own home and their own life from this unnecessary invasion into their neighborhood from very strong microwave radiation exposures. You can fix coverage by making them go on macro towers, and that is absolutely the least intrusive means to improve coverage. The most intrusive is to go in front of someone's home. So we will be holding you to your standards of reading what's in the public record to make your decisions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nicole Catano. I live at 29 5th Street West in Sonoma. One of these towers is proposed for my corner. I didn't know anything about it until some people came by to tell me. I never heard or saw any public notice, so that's one thing. I oppose the construction of cell towers in our neighborhoods. I have 3 issues: health, property values, and aesthetics. I suggest that you all go home tonight and picture one of these towers outside your house, or next to the place you love to sit in your beautiful garden that you've worked so hard to create. And imagine how you'd like it. I definitely don't want it in mine. So please do not let this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Good evening. My name's John Duffy. I'm a locksmith. My shop is at 564 First Street West. I looked at the telephone pole and I saw there's a tower going up at 574. I have tenants there and there's a residence nearby, and I'm aware that 4G and 5G, becoming 5G is dangerous to our health. And I thought you said not to speak about what's coming up, so, and everybody else is doing it, so I just came up to speak about it. I don't want it there. I think it's a threat to our well-being, and I hope you act accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Good evening, Commissioners. Tom Conlon, 18850 Robinson Road. Changing subjects for a moment, if you don't mind. I have recently become aware of an excellent book. I know it's not on your agenda per se tonight, but it also is possible that parking is never not on your agenda. And I just wanted to be sure that you're aware of this as well. This is Donald Shoup's new book about parking. He's the emeritus professor at UCLA who's been the guru on this topic for quite some time. He's just done a new summary of his work, and full of case studies of parking policy all over the planet. And his we can summarize them in 3 minutes. His three fundamental things to remember are: we need to remove off-street parking requirements, we need to charge the right pricing for on-street parking, and we need to spend the parking revenue to improve public services on those metered streets so that people in the community recognize the value of free parking, which is no longer free when it's managed properly. It's a paradigm shifting point of view on the world, and I encourage all of you to read more about these theories. I've provided some copies for you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else like to address this in public comment? Seeing none, I'm going to close this agenda item.
May I just?
No, you've had yours.
I would just like to hand these
yes,
to you
you
guys.
may do that.
Okay, I will.
Go for it.
Oh, right now.
It's very close. Great. Thank you.
We move to the next agenda item, which is review and acceptance of the agenda. And we do have one item that has been removed from the agenda. David?
Yes, item 6.2, that is an application for a use permit and parking exception to develop a property located at 19410 Sonoma Highway. This property is subject to environmental review, and just yesterday evening we learned from Caltrans, who is a responsible agency with respect to this environmental review, that they have additional comments to make. So because they are a responsible agency, which is a term that is defined under the California Environmental Quality Act as, basically having permitting authority over the project, the Planning Commission could not take action on the project tonight. And therefore, we are recommending that the Planning Commission continue this item to your regular meeting in August. And that can occur at the time that the item would normally come up.
Okay, and you need a motion to continue then?
At that time, yes.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we move on to late correspondence.
I believe there are only two items at your place tonight. One is a letter from Fred Allebach. This is with regard to item 7.1, and the other is the issues update.
Thank you. We'll move along with the items for the public hearing. The first one is an application for a use permit to reconfigure outdoor seating in conjunction with a wine tasting facility located at 373 First Street West. That will have the staff report. Wendy.
Thank you, Chair Felder and members of the Commission. The subject property is a 5,724 square foot parcel located on the west side.
Excuse me for a minute,
West.
Wendy. I'm sorry. We have a recusal of.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I'm sorry. So Commissioner Bohar must recuse for proximity. Thank you, Wendy. You may continue.
All right. The property is currently developed with a 1,160 square foot bungalow and detached garage, constructed in 1922. In 1993, the Planning Commission approved a use permit allowing conversion of the residence to commercial use. At that time, the property was under a prior R4 zoning designation that allowed limited commercial and mixed-use development. In 2013, the Planning Commission approved a use permit modification and a parking exception to allow 12 outdoor seats in the rear yard of the by appointment wine tasting facility. The applicants are currently operate their wine consulting company and premium winery business, Artur Wines, from the property, and would like to provide a small amount of outdoor seating in the front yard area for by appointment wine tastings. The outdoor seating would accommodate up to 8 people. No net increase in outdoor seating is proposed. 8 seats are proposed in the front yard area in the form of 3 tables, and 4 seats will continue to be offered in the rear yard area. The proposal is consistent with the general plan, and with regard to development code consistency, the proposed outdoor seating tasting would be ancillary to the current use, which includes by appointment wine tasting in conjunction with the applicant's wine consulting firm. A use permit is required for the new outdoor activity. Staff would note that there is no requirement for off-street parking associated with outdoor seating, and no increase in the number of outdoor seats is proposed. With regard to the discussion of project issues, there's currently an urgency ordinance establishing interim restrictions on the establishment of tasting rooms in the Plaza Retail Overlay District. The property is not located within the Plaza Retail Overlay District, so the urgency ordinance does not apply. And the other issue is with compatibility with surrounding properties, and in staff's view, that the proposed outdoor seating does not raise issues of compatibility with other land uses in the vicinity. While the subject property is zoned medium-density residential, and the proposed front yard seating area directly adjoins a single-family residence to the north, also zoned medium-density residential, the seating in this area is limited to 2 seats. Therefore, it's staff's opinion that the potential noise and activity would not negatively impact the residents to the north. While there are no limitations in the development code on hours for outdoor seating, because the tasting room adjoins a residential property, staff recommends limiting the use of the outdoor seating area from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., 7 days per week. And this limitation has been included as a condition of approval. And staff recommends the Planning Commission approve the project subject to conditions of approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Questions of staff? Seeing none, would the applicant like to make a presentation before us? And you may have 10 minutes if you need it.
Oh, 10. I thought I only had 3.
Well, you don't have
Okay.
to take 10.
Most of what I had to say is similar to what you just read. So, good evening. My name is Laura Uhas. We live at 426 Claudia Drive. This is my husband, Kenneth. We're business partners as husband and wife. And we've been operating our business out of 373 First Street West since 2011. I know we were here last week and we heard a lot of the tasting room discussion, and we did want to let you know that we were one of the original 13. So we do appreciate your support in looking at us not within the moratorium, as we're not in the retail overlay. We originally had our first request, which was more substantial outdoor seating, and we had some revisions after we talked with the developers and helped us sort of align with what was going to work within our community and maintains our low profile and low impact in our neighborhood. I just wanted to quickly read some clarifications on that might highlight that our request is consistent with the general plan. Again, we are not asking for a net increase in seating. It's just another option. It gets really warm even at 80 degrees in our backyard. We don't have a breeze. Just to go and be under these beautiful magnolia trees would be a nice option for us. Typically, we get 2 and 4, maybe a group of 6. The maximum we see probably in a week is 30 guests per week, which is, compared to our neighbors, pretty significantly less. So we don't feel that we're going to have a major impact in our neighborhood. We significantly revised our request to move the seats adjacent to the current wine facility that also has the privilege of outdoor seating. That is in the same exact zoning that we are. It's a residence that has turned into a tasting room, and they have outdoor seating out front. So our seats would align on their south side property, and then the north side, there's no front yard seating. Again, we ask that the moratorium not apply to our request. As you review our proposal tonight, Our business goals align directly to the local economy elements of policy 1.1 and 1.5 that focus on the retention of businesses that reinforce Sonoma's quality of agriculture, food, and wine, while offering jobs above industry standard and promote tourism that is consistent with the historic small town character of Sonoma. And we believe our business absolutely does that. Our commitment to maintain our historic home in the city standards and codes has been kept. We recently made a major investment into the exterior paint of our building, all going through the proper permit processes. We've played by the rules. We think we've been pretty responsible business owners. To address parking concerns, we do have the current requirement for our capacity. So just to wrap it up, we hope you understand our proposal is compliant to preserve the quality of our neighborhood and aligns with the directive of the general plan to retain businesses that reinforce Sonoma's distinctive qualities. Our reputation as neighbors and business owners have been highly respectful and responsible for the last 7 years, and we're seeking for your approval tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else care to speak on this subject?
Hi, I'm Bill Spencer. I've lived downtown near the plaza since 1978. Currently, I'm at 319 First Street West since '89. That's just a few doors north of the Artura, towards this way. And I do not approve of this commercial intrusion in my neighborhood. It will add pedestrian and auto congestion and affect the property value, my property value. Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm speaking as a resident of 299 First Street West. It's about 5 doors north of the applicant's property. I've met Laura and Ken, the owners of Artura, a couple of times, and I must say, they're very cordial. They've been accessible, willing to talk. They run a professional-looking facility. They're businesslike. The justification for the added front seating seems to be based on the interest in being competitive within the environment of a proliferation of tasting rooms and additional features which seem to be added to tasting rooms. Unfortunately, the expansion violates the regulations of the legal non-conforming use, which is the moniker for that parcel. At the very least, interpretation, I believe it violates the intent and spirit of the regulations. And I'd like to read that brief portion from Chapter 19.82, Non-Conforming Structures, Uses, and Parcels. It is the intent of this development code to discourage the long-term continuance of these nonconformities, but and permit them to exist under limited conditions. Perhaps I could take a second to narrate how this became a legal nonconforming use. Is there any question on the part of the commissioners that this is a legal nonconforming use, or may I give that narrative? I don't waste any of your time.
I think we'll have that discussion. So.
Okay. April 1993, the Planning Commission approved a use permit under R4 zoning, which allowed a residence to be converted to a commercial use. Later, the zoning was changed to RM, which is the current zoning where my house and this is located, medium density residential. It does not allow commercial use. Why were these regulations created? To protect the legal uses in that zoning, for example, my home and neighborhood in mixed-use residential. What's the likely impact of non-enforcement of these regulations? Once street side seating is allowed, the tasting room looks more like a bar, but it doesn't have a permit to be a bar. A short walk around the nearby tasting rooms will give you evidence of that down the street around the corner. Removing attractive front landscaping, which, by the way, this house is very well laid out, painted landscape. The landscaping, the fencing is quite lovely. It enhances the residential nature of the building. But as soon as you add this outside seating in the front, it really makes the commercial use of it much more intense. taking out the landscaping for commercial seating is much more neighborhood intrusive
Jim,
than
I'm
rear yard
sorry.
seating.
Jim, I'm sorry, your time is up.
Thank you.
Anyone else care to speak on this item?
David Eicher, I live in 10 Loma Court. And one of the issues I would have with moving some of the seating from backyard to the front yard, besides what has already been explained, that it's now visible to the neighborhood, is something that you hear a lot about in the city council is enforcement. Okay, how do we enforce something? So, how do you enforce limiting the number of seats in the backyard that you can't see? So so essentially by allowing the seats in the front, how do you enforce limiting the number of seats in the back? I mean, you already have a problem now. Don't know how many they actually hold from time to time. Maybe every once in a while they sneak in a couple extra people, like, a party reserves somebody that comes in. They have, we got a couple extra people. You don't know. And, and you won't know if you have the total number in front plus 12, 15, 16 in the back. So for that reason, I think you should really look hard and fast at this application and with that keeping in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Good evening again, Tom Conlon. This project strikes me as just an example of why we have a tasting room moratorium right now, which is to give ourselves some time to think about the cumulative effects of these many different businesses now that are engaged in wine tasting in that general neighborhood. From my perspective, and I think from the perspective of someone who is walking around the plaza as a visitor, it's really just a technicality that this parcel falls outside the scope of the current moratorium. So I would just beseech you to consider that as you deliberate on the cumulative effects that this project would be part of tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Anyone else? Seeing none, I'm going to bring it back to the commission for discussion and possible action.
I'd like to question the applicants if I can. Sure. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you, in the process of making this application, it came to us before several months ago, apparently, okay? And did you look at the use of the magnolia trees for where you might put the actual tables, okay? In other words, surround the trees with the tables. I'm very familiar with magnolias because I lived a lot of time in the South.
Same.
Right.
And I think they're fabulous, and they provide shade and coolness and everything else. That may be a design issue, but I don't know whether you have gone before design review yet, okay? But I think that I just want to ask that question. Did you look at that at all?
I don't completely understand your question. Or did we look at where
In
we're
other
actually
words,
placing the
you
tables?
You can build a table around
the tree.
Yeah. Did you look at
That
that?
actually was a
Because that-
consideration, and I think when, Laura, you looked at it, you were concerned with the rooting system?
I personally think the seats out front, the kind of European bistro style tables that we were looking at actually adds kind of a value to the look of the property. It looks charming, it looks European. We're trying to make it look more discreet. We're honestly just looking to enjoy the shade. It's 10 degrees cooler under those shaded trees than it is in the back under our umbrellas. We have no natural shade out in the back. So I think the neighbors, I understand what they're saying, and we tried to reassure them that we're just trying to have some nice tables out front in the shade. We did consider the table around the tree. It's just not quite the look that we were looking for kind of the historic property.
So you considered it and rejected it?
No, it's just, they're still under the trees.
She's just going for a lot less of a bar look.
Right.
And more of a bistro look.
We don't want to look like, we're not trying to do what some of the other tasting rooms are trying to do. I think Roche does have that.
Thank you.
I think they do
Sure,
have a
thank you.
tree bar.
Any other comments from commission at this point?
Thank you.
Question for staff. Are you aware, since this use has been approved back in 2013, have there been any formal complaints about how this facility has functioned?
We're not aware of any complaints.
Thank you.
Also, another question of staff, is this, following up on one of the public comments, is this a non-conforming use, a legal non-conforming use?
Well, since it has a use permit, it is a legal use. I mean, that's what a use permit gives you. It is the case that under current regulations, you can no longer apply for a commercial use in this zoning district, but there's a big caveat to that, which is the fact that this property is located within the historic overlay zone, and therefore it's possible to apply for an adaptive reuse, including wine tasting within that zone. Now, we did not regard this as an intensification of use because the number of seats is not increasing.
Okay, so when a use permit was granted in 2013, that changed it from a legal non-conforming use to a legal use?
It's a legal use.
Well, both would be legal, but
Right.
Is it described as non-conforming?
I would not characterize it as legal non-conforming.
Is
no.
the zone still residential?
Yes, it is. But again, you can apply for a commercial use on this property, as would be the case with other similarly situated properties, because it's in the historic overlay zone and because it would qualify for an adaptive reuse. That doesn't mean it would get such an approval, but it is something that one can apply for. So commercial use, notwithstanding the residential base zone, is an option for this property.
Okay, thank you.
Is there some further discussion by anybody else on the commission? Well, if you're not going to discuss, I'll discuss. I have some problems with this request because it is medium density residential zoning in this area right now. And I was on the commission when we granted them the use back in 2013 to have a tasting room there, but very specifically restricted the outdoor seating to the backyard. I can understand that in the kind of thing of competition and everything else that goes on in the local area, that it'd be nice to expand their seating, or at least to relocate their seating to the front yard. But to me, that results in, if not an intensification, certainly a change of use, which I don't think is consistent with that zoning designation. And I really do not want to see the creep of tasting rooms into the residential zones, and I think having tasting in the front yard does that. So I cannot support this request.
Chair Felder?
Yeah.
When you approved this use permit back in 2013, or the Planning Commission back then, and you restricted seating to the backyard, what was the reason for that? Was seating requested in the front yard back then? Or was there any discussion about this being a residence?
The only thing on the table was seating at the backyard at that point, but it was certainly, and there was an issue concerning parking, but it was restricted to only having backyard seating.
All right, thank you.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, it's okay. I was not part of the 2013 decision, so I do not have all the history behind it. Having reviewed the site and the context in the neighborhood, and with a focus on the fact that there has not been an increased intensification, do not see an intensification of the use given the relocation of the tables. I think that if there have been no complaints to date regarding it functioning as a tasting room, and with the way that the street is energized from that location on up to Spain Street, I'm going to have to hear more arguments not to support it, given the fact that it's not increasing the number of tables and that it's just a matter of use in the front.
So, can I go again? Thank you.
Absolutely.
So my issues are, I have a few issues with this application. The first is the taste room moratorium. It's not in the Plaza Retail overlay, but it's, from what I understand, across the street in one direction, and I believe a door north on the other direction. And so it's certainly within the spirit of the Plaza Retail overlay, and so I think we should consider that in the context of our decision. I also think we need to consider the fact that it's a residential zone, and I have a feeling, well, I don't know for sure, but I have a feeling that some of the discussion back in 2013 that granted a use permit to this property, I'm sure it went more smoothly because there was no front yard seating in a residential zone. And so it's sort of like we can't have it both ways. Well, if they're not bound by the moratorium because they're not in the Plaza Retail overlay, okay, but it's also in the residential zone. And so is it appropriate to have front yard seating in a residential zone? Number two, the reason why I was asking about the legal nonconforming use is because I was looking up this chapter that a member of the public discussed, and it and so I just don't know if we're going to have an issue in terms of nonconforming use, because from what I understand, it basically says you can continue a nonconforming use in the wrong zone, and you can expand that use with a use permit approved by the Planning Commission within a structure, but it doesn't say anything about land. And so adding seating outside the structure, I'm just wondering if there are any potential conflicts with our code on that. And so that's sort of where I'm leaning now, and I would love to hear where Commissioner Cribb thinks about this.
Well, since you asked, I'm more in line with Commissioner Wellender in terms of the non-intensification of use. And while I recognize this isn't a residential zone, it's actually my belief that part of what makes residential zones functional, in fact, many of the houses further to the north actually represent that because they're older, where they actually have the front porches pushed very close to the street. And the idea being that there's an engagement between the inhabitants and the pedestrians, and so it was sort of a neighborly kind of thing, that you would be on your front porch and you would engage with your neighbors. And I think there's been, post-World War II, this kind of retreat to the backyard and the sort of exclusion of the neighborhood in most residential design. And I think, to me, this supports, especially at the scale. I mean, this is, if they were asking for 20 seats out there or something, I could understand the objections perhaps. But, I mean, I know there's a particular house on 2nd Street East that I tend to walk by quite frequently on my daily walk, where probably in the last year, the people built a little area out in their front yard, and they put in some tables and chairs because their house was set further back. So they actually built a space closer to the street with tables and chairs as a way to engage, I think, in the community and in a better way. So for me, because of the scale of this operation, because it's not an intensification of use, and I actually think, in my mind, it helps reinforce the notion of a residential neighborhood more so than this sort of empty facade that you never see any activity or life in, because I think residents in residential neighborhoods should have some vibrancy to it. And so I don't see any reason to not allow this, notwithstanding some ruling on the technicality of it pointed out between the idea of a structure and not a structure. So, and whether it's illegal or not, I mean, I don't think I'm prepared at this point to have studied that issue enough. But I'm just saying, on the face of this, the fact that it's not an intensification of use, they're not asking for any more seats. And I'm always a little, I mean, to Mr. Eicher's point, this notion that people are trying to pull a fast one or hide something, I think is a rather unseemly sort of suggestion that you should lead with that people are out to fake us out or something. I mean, I think you have to, and given what Commissioner Welander asked, there's been no complaints about this business. So I assume they've been running a very quiet business that's compatible with the neighborhood. They've received no complaints, and I take them at their word. I don't think that they have 30 guests a week. That's not many people over the course of a week. So I don't see this as being a major issue. I would support this.
May I speak? Okay. Personally, I think that this particular use in that area is totally appropriate. I think that outdoor seating works very well, and it works well with the neighborhood and with the surrounding uses. I mean, if you look at it, we have major wine tasting areas, within a half a block of one another with this use. And I personally don't see any problem whatsoever with the outdoor seating. I think it's an appropriate use. I think that the applicants have done a fine job in terms of the appearance of the property. I think the fencing is beautiful. I'd love to see something that really incorporates the magnolia trees, only because they provide coolness, and that's important in Sonoma. But that's not my job. My job is to say yay or nay. I totally support the application to proceed with outdoor seating.
So David, do you have any thoughts about the conflict with the 19.82 code?
Well, again, this particular use, as the chair pointed out, was approved with a use permit in 2013, right? The zoning of this property hasn't changed since then. The rules haven't changed. This is a revision to that use permit that was approved in 2013. So I just do not regard this as an expansion of a legal non-conforming use. I don't think that shoe fits. And that's not to say that some of your other issues with respect to compatibility are not a basis for voting to deny it. That's the name of the game with any use permit. But I don't see that, I don't believe that there's any issue with respect to the legal non-conforming question.
Well, I'm hearing my fellow commissioners generally in support. I still am not swayed totally by the argument, because this is not a residential use. It is not a couple of neighbors sitting out in their front yard engaging with the neighborhood. This is a commercial business that is in the business of selling wine, and to me, there's a danger of the creep of tasting rooms going to continue to up the north on First Street West to further intrude in the residential area. And at some point, I think you have to draw the line and say, am I going to create a precedent or a benchmark for continuing this to go all the way up the street, or am I going to draw the line and saying this is a residential zone and I'd like to keep it a residential zone? So I still cannot support it. But if there's no further comment, I'll have somebody make a motion, or if you want to continue the discussion, that's fine.
I'd like to continue the discussion. If if we had another applicant come before us soliciting a use permit for wine tasting on a parcel that currently does not have such a use, we as a commission would have the ability to either say yay or nay to the applicant, provided that there isn't some overriding direction from city council that says there's a moratorium, so it's just a waste of time. So I want to make sure I understand that we as a commission right now still have some leverage in either discouraging or encouraging wine tasting creep.
Well, one other fact that back in 2013, there was no distinction that could be made between a commercial use for wine tasting versus any other retail business. So it was considered another retail business coming in and requesting a use permit. The fact of all of the proliferation of tasting rooms hadn't really started in earnest at that point. And part of the problem we've had is that because there have been so many more tasting rooms, we are now trying to distinguish that use from other retail uses.
Continuing on, question to David. If a future applicant was to come forward with a request for a tasting room, and based upon what Chair Felder had mentioned about before there was no distinction between a commercial use and wine tasting, can we look at it just in the eyes of wine tasting as a use versus commercial, or would another applicant be just lumped into a commercial use? That's not very clear, but in light of the proliferation of wine tasting in the last, say, 10 years, the fact that it is a hot button right now, the fact that the council has put a moratorium on there, would an applicant come forward under the umbrella of a commercial use, or would it be more specifically looked upon as wine tasting?
Well, just to back up for a moment, absent the moratorium that's in place right now and absent any future changes to the development code, wine tasting facilities are regarded as a retail use. As a retail use, they are a permitted use in the commercial zone. And so the chair is correct that within the commercial zoning district, there was no distinction between a wine tasting use and other kinds of retail uses, and they were not even subject to use permit review. This particular property, though, is not in the commercial zoning district, as has been pointed out, and so this activity could only be allowed as an adaptive reuse of a historic structure, which is what occurred in 2013. So in that instance, it's a use permit review. Use permit review is about primarily compatibility. Now, that said, compatibility can be defined in, well, different ways, some more narrowly and some more broadly. Right now, we do have a moratorium on new wine tasting facilities or the expansion of wine tasting facilities within the Plaza Retail Overlay District. That moratorium is contained within the boundaries of the Plaza Retail Overlay District, and so the use permit findings that are before you tonight don't make reference to that moratorium. But that said, just to take what I think is the perspective that is perhaps advocated by Chair Felder, compatibility can be defined fairly broadly in that if there's concern that this is adding to a proliferation of outdoor seating associated with wine tasting uses throughout the downtown area that is not appropriate, that's a basis for turning this down. It's not just about whether or not it's going to affect the immediate neighbor. It can be, your consideration can be broader than that.
David, do we have any other tasting rooms in residential zones?
It's a really great question, and off the top of my head, I don't know the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you know what?
Hawk, so-
Thank you. Hawks is also similarly zoned. And so is, for example, everyone's favorite example of the one on West Main Street. Roche.
Okay, thank you.
I would argue that Sebastiani isn't a residential. It is surrounded by residences, though it may have, it may be zoned differently, but I mean, its function is within a residential neighborhood.
If there's no further discussion, if someone would care to make a motion?
I'll move that we approve the application as submitted.
I'll second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed?
No.
No. Motion carries 3-2. Congratulations, you have front yard seating.
Thank you very much. Good luck with retirement. Enjoy it.
Okay, let's move on to item 6.2, and I would like to have a motion that we continue this item. Since we need further input from the state.
I'll move that we continue this item to the August 30th. Oh,
Perhaps 8th?
8th?
Yeah.
August 8th, regular meeting.
Is it 8th or 9th?
I'll second.
Just waiting. Else, a little
You know
bit
what,
there.
we're.
It is the 9th.
Staff is wrong, it's the 9th.
Okay. Friendly
You can admit-
amendment.
Yeah.
I
I
would
withdraw my
like to
second.
amend that to August 9th.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 6-0. I believe we are in items for discussion, item 7.1. So this is going to be a preliminary discussion of issues associated with the pending comprehensive update of the city's general plan. Planning Director Goodison.
Thank you, Chair Felder and members of the Planning Commission. It is a goal of the City Council to perform a comprehensive update of the city's general plan. And that is a very important undertaking, and it's one of the key functions that the Planning Commission has, that of being typically the kind of managing commission associated with any kind of general plan update, much less a comprehensive update of the general plan. So we wanted to get this issue in front of the Planning Commission. This is very much an early discussion of what's involved and what that process might look like. But it is something that will be undertaken this year, and it's timely to begin that conversation. So before we get into some of the whys associated with pursuing this undertaking, let's talk about just what a general plan is. It's required by state law. It's a comprehensive and long-term policy document. It is one of the primary means by which a city, through policy, links community values, vision, and objectives, and it is a blueprint for the future of the community. It consists of elements or topic areas that are required by state law. It may also include optional elements that reflect local issues and priorities, and it includes necessary background analysis. And as you can imagine, the process is sort of loaded in the opposite direction, beginning with a lot of research, analysis, discussion of alternatives, leading to the policies and objectives that are ultimately decided upon through community input direction from the Planning Commission and City Council. So our current general plan is the 2020 general plan, which is one reason why the council is interested in undertaking a general plan update. The expiration date, so to speak, of our current general plan is fast upon us. This current general plan was adopted in 2006. There have been subsequent updates of the housing element twice and also the circulation element. And as is typically the case, this document was prepared by a team of consultants with extensive staff involvement. And I'm not trying to leave out the community, the public, commissions, et cetera, when I say that, but just in terms of document preparation, performing research, developing background information, that is typically a staff and consultant intensive process. Now, in addition to, or in conjunction with just the fact that this current general plan only looks forward to the year 2020, it is important to perform a comprehensive general plan update on a regular basis because times change, issues change, community priorities change. When this general plan was adopted, that Planning Commission and that City Council had a clear understanding of what those goals meant, what those policies were intended to achieve. The words in the general plan haven't changed, but we have a whole new generation of residents in Sonoma where there are people who have grown up here or people who have moved here since then. And so the kind of shared discussion and vision that went into that general plan that was adopted in 2006, that was a long time ago. And it needs to be refreshed, and it's time to do that. The current structure of the general plan is based on, as I mentioned, elements, in particular state mandated elements, those being land use, circulation, housing, open space, conservation, safety, and noise. In the Sonoma general plan, open space and conservation have been combined into an environmental resources element, and we have also the optional element of the local economy element. I'm going to be kind of going through this next set of slides fairly quickly because this is just a background discussion and we want to get to your input and conversation. But I do want to just kind of point out some of the basic policies that are embedded in the current general plan because I think that in many cases they do represent broad directions that will be carried forward in one form or another in a future general plan update. And I say that because Sonoma, while it tends to be forward-thinking in terms of environmental issues and social issues, is also conservative in the sense of protecting its historic identity, protecting its scale, and protecting its character. And much of our current general plan policies have to do with those kinds of objectives as well as environmental resources and addressing social issues. So beginning with the community development element, that element is really at the centerpiece of the general plan. It establishes the pattern of land use. It sets forth design requirements. It addresses the provision of public services. And crucially, it also includes an urban growth boundary policy. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the urban growth boundary is another key reason for beginning this general plan update now, because that too has an expiration date that is also approaching. And lastly, the community development element addresses the preservation of historic resources. So here we have the land use plan, and on this map we have identified the land areas that are associated with the different land use designations within Sonoma. As really this is evident in looking at the color designations, when you look at low density residential, Sonoma residential, which is a relatively low density designation, that constitutes more than a third of the land use designations in Sonoma. Look look at medium density residential, high density residential housing opportunity, that's less than 15%. Mixed use and commercial combined are about 11% of the land area in Sonoma in terms of designation. And then we also have designations that protect environmental resources, sometimes completely, like in the form of a park or an open space preserve, and sometimes through just restrictive zoning, such as the hillside residential zone. And that area is actually pretty extensive. Parkland, that designation is more than 10%. Hillside zoning adds another 3%. We also have some agricultural zoning designations within land use designations and within the city of Sonoma, which is actually extremely rare within an incorporated community. But again, it's part of Sonoma's identity, and it's something that has been maintained. So let's look at the urban growth boundary for a moment. The urban growth boundary was adopted by voters in the year 2000 for a 20-year term. The urban growth boundary prohibits utility extensions and annexations for development beyond its boundaries. And it is coterminous with the sphere of influence. So that just means that they are one and the same line on a map, with the exception of the Montini Preserve. And that exception is allowed for in the urban growth boundary because the Montini Preserve didn't involve the expansion of utilities. It was an open space protection measure, and so it can be annexed to the city, the urban growth boundary notwithstanding. When its term ends, the urban growth boundary will remain in place, but at that point, it may be modified by the city council. So through the year 2020, it cannot be modified unless there was some kind of subsequent vote of the people, or under some very restrictive terms that are set forth in the language of that initiative that is actually set forth in its policy and implementation language in the general plan. Because when the voters adopted that initiative, they adopted it as a kind of an insert into the general plan. So that while the general plan has changed, that language remains in place. Those provisions allowing for changes to the urban growth boundary primarily addressed two conditions. One condition had to do with applications that were already pending at the time that the urban growth boundary was adopted that might have been in conflict with the boundary. There were no such applications, and so that really never came up as an issue. The other exception process that is set forth in the urban growth boundary initiative language, it has to do with annexations for affordable housing. It allows limited annexations for affordable housing of up to, I think, 5 acres per year, subject to the city council making some very specific findings. And not to get too deeply into the weeds, in looking at those findings, it's hard to imagine that they could ever be met. So the urban growth boundary is very intentional about making sure that urban development is contained within its limits. That is not a flaw or a side effect. That is the purpose of the urban growth boundary, and it has been effective in that regard. But now that the term of the urban growth boundary is ending, we anticipate that there will be renewed interest in adopting an urban growth boundary, again through some kind of voter adoption process, because that is the only way in which it can be basically embedded for a 20-year period without any allowance for alteration through the normal general plan process. And that was an objective of the original effort, and this effort was not confined to the city of Sonoma. It was pretty much throughout the Bay Area at the time. And that will be an objective of kind of the next generation of the urban growth boundary. But that said, and all of that said, possible changes or alterations to the urban growth boundary are going to be a key discussion point in this upcoming general plan update, and it's an issue that really needs to be addressed relatively early on in the update, I would imagine. Are there, I'm happy to take questions while we go through this. You know, certainly. What's that?
You do or you don't want questions.
Oh, I'm happy to take them while we're going along.
So please ask.
Yeah, go ahead, please ask.
So in terms of the urban growth boundary, it expires in 2020. Is it desirable and possible to review that, possibly make changes, possibly leave it in place and renew it again during that discussion period for another period of time so that it doesn't lapse? And what are the risks of and the downfall of it, the downside of it lapsing?
Well, since I would say that people are going to have different opinions about
Sure.
the downside of it lapsing, and by lapsing, I'm thinking that maybe there might be at most a 2-year gap, you know, between maybe it goes to the voters in 2022 instead of 2020. Some would say that that is not a significant difference. Others might be very concerned about such a difference, but the bottom line is that right now, through this general plan process, there is an opportunity for the Planning Commission and the City Council, with input from the public, to revisit the urban growth boundary and make sure that whatever urban growth boundary is established as part of this general plan is something that is consistent with a 2040 general plan, so that it might be somewhat different than this current urban growth boundary. I don't believe that now that the urban growth boundary is approaching its term, I think it, as part of a general plan process, it's particularly appropriate to look at whether or not this particular boundary is going to be what people want for the next 20 years. Now, I personally don't expect that, you know, just given, again, Sonoma's long history as and interest in, you know, again, maintaining its character and qualities, that there's going to be some kind of proposal to massively expand the urban growth boundary. That would be shocking to me. But, you know, that said, if we're looking 20 years ahead, right now we've got about 30 acres, between 30 and 40 acres of land within the urban growth boundary that, you know, has development potential of, say, low-density residential and upward. And if you're looking out 20 years, you need to decide, the community needs to decide, whether or not that is an adequate amount of land for the next 20 years.
So the discussion, revision, potential approval, that within the discussion environment could happen, but that's not final until it's a referendum. Is that what I understand?
Well, any city can adopt an urban growth boundary really at any time, but I would say that the Greenbelt Alliance in particular has a very specific definition of what an urban growth boundary means, and what they mean by an urban growth boundary is a voter-adopted initiative that cannot be substantially altered, that has a minimum term of 20 years. I don't think I'm off base in saying that that is kind of their framework for an urban growth boundary. Now, I guess that I would just say that one of the early things that is done in a general plan update is to develop projections, to develop land use scenarios. And so there's an opportunity fairly early on in the general plan update to address this issue. And I think that it is also, and that therefore it would be very well possible to define an urban growth boundary and possibly even have it established by the voters prior to the adoption of the general plan, because you know where you're going at that point. But that is going to be the subject of a whole set of conversations and decisions that we will not complete tonight, that's for sure.
But just to go on the last point on this chart, when 2020 appears, the boundary doesn't go away so that people can build anywhere, anytime. It would have to take some action by the city council to modify it, or it would continue. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. And that modification would have to be in the form of a general plan amendment, which is not something that you just do on the spot. It's an involved process to amend a general plan, even in a seemingly straightforward way as that. And the other thing that I would mention is kind of an additional layer of, I don't know, security, if you will. The city has a growth management ordinance. And that too limits what can happen and when in terms of development. So it's not like, oh, 2020 comes and a person can just show up and say, hey, I want to build 100 units on this property outside of the urban growth boundary. That could not happen.
May I ask one question? If it is the goal of this planning commission, city council, and ultimately, most importantly, the citizens to renew the urban growth boundary in 2020 so there is no lapse, are we on a schedule that will allow that to happen at this point?
I don't believe that, well, okay. The first answer to that question is that could happen. But the second answer to that question is that the general plan update as a whole probably would not be completed by that date. I would be surprised if it were.
But you encouraged, or you said it made more sense to renew, if that is the intent, the UGB before the general plan?
Well, I'm saying that there are two options.
Okay.
You could take this issue on as kind of an early part of the general plan update process, and it's a natural thing to do. It's an early part of the general plan update process is to look at different land use scenarios and think about where things should go, and through that process get direction on an urban growth boundary that could be adopted prior to the completion of the general plan update. Or you could wait upon the completion of the general plan update to bring an urban growth boundary initiative before the voters, because that gives you kind of maximum protection and flexibility in terms of refining it as might be necessary, but that would take it past 2020.
If I may, David, so the growth management ordinance exists separate from the urban growth boundary?
Correct.
Yes, but they were initially passed at about the same time, is that correct?
Actually, the growth management ordinance, I believe, was adopted in 1980.
Oh, okay, so it was well before, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, all right. And is the growth, so that's separate, that's not an issue relative to the general plan?
I would say it's an issue indirectly in that the growth management ordinance limits the amount of residential development that can occur in Sonoma over time. And so that helps define what can happen between now and the year 2040. If, say, the year 2040 was your horizon date and you were assuming that growth was not going to exceed what's currently allowed for in the growth management plan, it kind of sets a ceiling in terms of residential development. But you might look at that and through the general plan update process decide that you want that ceiling to be higher or lower, which could lead to, to changes in the growth management ordinance. So cities do have policies, and cities revisit those policies and can modify them. The growth management ordinance has only been modified downwards for, most of its existence. All right, local economy element encourages small businesses. Again, these are just existing policy directions to encourage small business, emphasize the relationship between tourism and agriculture, provide jobs and housing opportunities for all economic segments, and promote economic development that enhances Sonoma's quality of life. The housing element, that update was completed in 2015, and it has a number of policies that encourage diversity in the house type, size, and tenure of housing while maintaining quality of life, facilitating the development of affordable housing, providing for senior housing, using different tools to increase the availability of affordable housing, such as the inclusionary ordinance, and addressing special housing needs, such as homelessness and other kinds of supportive housing. The circulation element, that was most recently updated in 2016. Right now within the plaza area, it explicitly prioritizes pedestrian safety and convenience with respect to circulation improvements in the plaza. That's a policy choice. That policy choice can change. It talks about context-sensitive solutions to reduce traffic congestion and improve pedestrian circulation at the Broadway-Napa intersection. And that basically means that we have yet to really figure out what to do with that intersection because there's just no clear agreement on how to address it at this point. However, there is strong direction in the element to implement a road diet along the Broadway corridor and to collaborate with Caltrans and the county in exploring potential ways to accommodate regional traffic on routes other than Highway 12 through the Sonoma Plaza. Environmental resources element addresses the preservation of significant natural features, calls for defining the sphere of influence with open space, making open space areas more accessible, and promoting sustainable practices. Public safety, addressing and minimizing risks, providing for essential services and also for coordinating emergency response. Noise, assessing the local noise environment and protecting existing and future uses from noise impacts. So those are some of the current policy directions that are set forth in the existing general plan. In this upcoming general plan update, it's going to be necessary to, before you get into the policy discussion too deeply, to really dig into data so that you've got information about what's going on now, what is expected to happen over the next 20 years, whatever that timeline turns out to be, so that you've got an informational basis on which to make policy. And these slides, which I'm going to go through very quickly because it would be impossible to read them, talk about the basic data needs that are associated with all of these different elements. And this is basically a very condensed version of what's in the state of California's general plan update guidelines, of which we'll all get a copy of shortly. And it's actually, as these things go, a pretty good read. As these things go. I do need to obviously add that caveat. So the land use element. What are the population, looking at population data, looking at growth forecasts, demographic trends, inventorying existing land use within the planning area, identifying key assets, identifying limitations that could affect the location and type of future growth, looking at the differentiation of land use, analyzing urban form, and developing projections for specific land uses based on those future population changes and also anticipated changes in environmental and economic conditions. In the circulation element, obviously we do updated traffic counts and traffic projections. We look at maintenance needs, funding requirements, look at demographics and how those might affect changes in how transportation works, identify safety issues, look at GHG emission data existing and projected. Part of this circulation element update is going to be developing what's called a vehicle miles traveled standard for the city of Sonoma, because that's going to be a state requirement coming up soon. And identifying needed improvements based on the land use alternative that is ultimately favored through this process. The housing element, again, looking at population and demographic trends and conditions, looking at households through income levels, identifying the number of overpaying households, quantifying the housing characteristics. We have a housing element that was updated fairly recently and that will be valid through the year, I believe, 2023. And that time frame is the result of the fact that the housing element is really on a separate track in terms of how it gets updated from the rest of the general plan. The housing element updates are tied to the regional housing needs allocation process. That typically occurs every 7 years. And so since we have a valid housing element, we will probably not need to do quite as much of the research that might have otherwise been the case, because what we have is relatively recent. But we are going to have to take a look at it, and we are going to have to make sure that it corresponds to whatever changes are made to, say, the land use element, or the circulation element, or the environmental resources element, because a key aspect of the general plan is that all of the elements are equal, and they all must be integrated. You can't have conflicting directions within these different general plan elements. Conservation and open space. That is basically looking at natural resource systems, sustainability issues, flood management, soil resources, water needs, identifying flood-prone areas and water recharge areas. And also, didn't mean to skip ahead that far, the open space element, looking at different open space categories and inventorying them, assessing the needs for open space based on demographic and development trends, mapping areas that require the preservation of sensitive plant or animal habitat, identifying outstanding areas of outstanding scenic, historic, or cultural value, and so forth. The noise element. In Sonoma, this really, I don't want to say it completely boils down to traffic, but a lot of what the noise element will look at is going to be based on traffic, because traffic is one of the major noise sources within the city of Sonoma. We don't have that much in terms of industrial uses. In fact, we don't have any industrial zones whatsoever, unless you consider the Wying production zone to be an industrial zone. So the primary issues that are addressed in Sonoma's noise element will be noise caused by existing and future traffic, and also identifying processes for identifying potential noise conflicts in new development applications and resolving them through the application process. Public safety. Obviously, that's been highlighted recently. Over the past couple of years, we've had, a number of flooding incidents. That's relatively common within Sonoma and Sonoma County. But obviously, last October, while we, as a city, were spared, we were certainly part of a valley that was just in a county that was devastated in parts by a terrible wildland fire that could very well have done damage to property within the city of Sonoma if conditions had been only slightly different. And so that's something that we need to look at very closely. The local economy element. So again, this is an optional element, but these are the kinds of things that are done in developing such an element, identifying community issues and preferences, conducting a business survey, doing inventories of current industry and business segments, identifying wage estimates, cost of living information, workforce characteristics, and doing a strengths and weaknesses analysis. And one of the objectives that has been set by the City Council as part of this general plan update is to develop an economic strategic plan, because that's been a kind of continuing point of discussion in terms of just the balance of Sonoma's economy, and that seems like a very direct way of carrying forward that discussion and getting resolution on it. I'm going to skip that slide because it's related to a slide that I decided to delete. So, key issues. The urban growth boundary. We've had a discussion of that already. That is a key issue. Meeting diverse housing needs. Even though we have an updated housing element, that doesn't mean we don't have a big housing challenge, because we do. And meeting housing needs is going to be an important discussion in this general plan update. Developing a vision for the downtown that addresses business composition, parking, pedestrians, traffic. That's been a big point of discussion on the part of the Planning Commission in a number of different applications that have been before you recently. Again, the development of an economic strategy is an objective of the council as part of this general plan update. I'm sure that through this update process, there's going to be a conversation about how tourism can be balanced with the quality of life and town character. Sustainability is a key issue, including climate change and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In some of the correspondence, it's been stated that there is no standalone greenhouse gas element that's proposed in this general plan, and that is because the structure of this general plan update has not yet been determined. That could happen. Or maybe it would be folded into another element. Some communities have an air quality element as a standalone element. So there are different ways to address the issue of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. A standalone element is one of them, but it's not the only way, and that is an issue that simply hasn't been decided yet. City-valley connections and relationships. That's always part of the conversation in Sonoma because we are part of Sonoma Valley, and that's a wonderful thing. Sonoma Valley is where the open space is, it's where the agricultural land is, it's where there are a lot of great communities are, including a community that I live in. But it isn't part of the city of Sonoma, and so that can lead to kind of awkward moments or exchanges in terms of just how, local governance proceeds. But it's such an embedded and important relationship that we can't take it for granted, and it just needs to be part of any discussion of a city general plan update. And of course, there are many, many others. I'm sure that tonight and throughout this process, there's going to be 50 or 100 more issues that come up with respect to the general plan update, because a general plan, it just addresses so many aspects of the life of the community. But we just wanted to highlight what our current thinking is in terms of what some of those key issues are going to turn out to be. And again, just to kind of highlight our context, Sonoma Valley has an area of 143 square miles, of which the city of Sonoma is less than 3. On the other hand, we have more than a quarter of the population within Sonoma Valley. Community outreach and engagement. Ultimately, a general plan is an expression of a community's vision and values. And to the extent that a general plan is an accurate reflection of those vision and values, that is the extent to which it is successful. So the process for updating a general plan has to incorporate a strategy and provide effective tools for community participation. And that includes identifying stakeholders, providing opportunities for broad-based community participation. We intend to conduct a community survey as part of this update process. We will be providing online access to informational materials and other documents. And of course, there will be numerous public hearings, workshops, and other events throughout the update process. And so, for example, in the 2020 general plan update, we had more than 20 public hearings and study sessions on that update. And I'm sure there will be no less in this process. As far as next steps, right now we're working on research on best practices in community engagement, economic strategy development, and other topics related to the update. There will be, early this fall, a City Council study session to identify and review key topic areas and discuss alternative update and engagement strategies. That will be followed at the subsequent meeting with council direction on the parameters and structure of the update. Staff would then prepare a request for proposals that would be reviewed by both the Planning Commission and the City Council. And once the RFP is circulated, a consultant team would be selected, and it would only be after that that the update process would commence in earnest. But it is a lengthy and multi-year endeavor that is going to require considerable attention and hours on the part of the Planning Commission. So, thank you.
On the study session with City Council, is that going to be a joint one between us and the Planning Commission and City Council? Or?
It could be. That hasn't been determined.
I would suggest that that be considered.
That's all I have for the moment. So we are here. We want to treat this as a normal item, so if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. then there would be public comment, and then commission discussion, but there is no action to be taken on this item tonight.
I might ask if you would please send this PowerPoint presentation to each of us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Just a comment about Chair Felder's last comment about the joint meeting. I was involved in the general plan development in Emeryville for a couple of years, and it's vague. It was 6 or 7 years ago. But it seems to me that there was a joint meeting. Well, actually, at that time, the City Council and the Planning Commission were the same. But now that I've thought about it, having a joint meeting here, particularly with the public input, I think would be very important, because then the public input goes to both bodies at the same time and have this same kind of discussion. I thought that was positive.
Yes, that can be a very positive feature, both in terms of convenience and just having a back and forth. And it's also pretty typical, and is typical of the general plan updates that have been held in Sonoma in the past.
I have a quick question for you, David. You flipped to the next subject before I got a chance to ask you this, but when we were talking about your urban growth boundary, okay? So basically, it's a ballot measure that technically dies in 2020, correct?
Well, the ballot measure doesn't go away. It's just that the way that the ballot measure is written, through a 20-year term, the urban growth boundary cannot be altered or amended, except that it could be reduced, except in those very specific circumstances that I mentioned. After 2020, the urban growth boundary can be amended by a majority vote of the City Council. But because the urban growth boundary is part of the general plan, it's not even quite that simple. An alteration to the urban growth boundary would be a general plan amendment. Any general plan amendment is subject to an environmental review. Any general plan amendment has to go through the Planning Commission. And so it's not like it could just be altered without a lot of discussion and review and hearings, both, again, before the Planning Commission and the City Council.
Okay, is it mandatory, in your opinion, legally, that it can only be until the year 2020? I mean, for example, could urban growth boundary be adopted or modified by the City Council to go on forever?
I am aware of urban growth boundaries that have terms of longer than 20 years, but I'm not aware of an urban growth boundary whose terms call for it to be in perpetuity, and I'm not sure, I rather doubt that would be legal.
Can general plan amendments be subject to referendum by the public?
I believe so.
So if a council were to change the urban growth boundary once it was expired, the public could always weigh in?
Oh, yes.
I think what I'd like to do, if you have no objections, open it up to public comment at this point and give them a chance to speak, and then we can have further discussion or questions as we see fit. So with that, I'll open up public comment.
Hi, Logan Harvey, 578 Smadera Drive. So I think the idea of having the Planning Commission and City Council meet together and discuss the general plan is a great one. I think that should definitely be pursued, especially if it involves the public as well. I would furthermore suggest that the CSEC be involved as well, especially if we're going to talk about the environment. The people that I know in the CSEC are very, very well versed in these issues, whether that be groundwater, whether that be vehicle miles traveled, climate change issues, and things like that. So I think bringing them in on there would be really important, especially as we kind of continue to deal with the effects of climate change, which are going to be drought, which are going to be continued fires and other issues like that. I also want to speak a little bit about community character. Whenever we have housing projects that come before Planning Commission, City Council, we always hear this issue, especially when it results in parking or larger structures with more dense housing, that it's affecting community character. And I grew up in this town. I'm born and raised here, so 30 years in Sonoma. And to me, the community character has changed in the way that this used to be a place where working class families could own a home and live. And that's no longer the case. If you drive down MacArthur past Presswood, you can tell all these little cottages that used to be working class homes are now going for $1.2 million a year. And so to me, one of the goals, if we're looking forward 20 years, should be to try to retain some of that ability, that Sonoma be able to have working class families live here, buy homes here, and stay in this community. I think that's what kind of powers the community. That's what generates interesting new businesses. That's what keeps children here, which I think is nice to see children playing in the plaza. And it provides access for teachers, nurses, and all firefighters and cops and everybody that kind of make this city run to live here. City staff as well. And so I think we need to start moving aggressively to protect that. Suggestions that I would have would be things like have further striations when we're talking about inclusionary requirements. So go beyond 20%, but also to require at the 120 level, the 150 level, that those be put in. Because if we're looking at trying to keep that UGB restricted, which I agree is ideal, but we'll see how it all plays out, we need to be really, really specific about what we want built in Sonoma. And I think we should be a little bit more restrictive on what it is that is required to be able to build here. Also, I think we need to be a little bit more specific and a little bit harsher with the way that things are overturned. With example of the West Napa Street Hotel, they had the requirement to build housing on it, but it was waived because they were going to bring economy into Sonoma. We already have a fair bit of tourism here. And I think that the easy waiving of restrictions and requirements like that is kind of a problem with the current general plan. And so I would look at those as well. And I would also look at trying to require housing based on number of employees as well as business building areas size. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Logan.
Good evening, Fred Allebach, 19550 8th Street East. I did send my letter. I can't recap the whole letter, so I hope that it's just the beginning of the process, so I had some thoughts on the general plan and take them for what they're worth. I think that there should be a standalone climate protection element, and I would encourage you to really have a look at the data there and maybe have even a look at the City of Palo Alto sustainability plan, and then compare that to what the Sonoma page looks like. There's really all the evidence is there is that this is something that we need to address, and I think a standalone element is the way to go with that. And I was noticing with some of the people earlier that their public comments seem to go on forever, but they haven't got to their 3 minutes. But when I'm up here, it seems like my 3 minutes just disappears like fog. So I don't know why that is, but I think, there's a lot of the UGB. I hope that we can have an open-minded look at all the different scenarios that, there will certainly be posturing in the general plan process for people to advocate for their interests in many different ways. And so I think it's important that if we can't have an end product that won't have conflicting different elements, so like I had mentioned in my letter, it won't be like William Blake's Bible quote where somebody can read the general plan one way and someone else comes in and quotes it, but they're both having different arguments and they're at cross purposes. So I think that's an important aspect of this, and that that highlights that it's a really good opportunity to open up a sustainability frame in general, which has a triple bottom line framework, has full cost accounting, and that's the perfect way to integrate all these different elements. You have economy, environment, society. This is the framework that can be used. And if you look at some consultants like Fodor and Associates, that's how they frame this up. So you can look at this, from a business as usual standpoint, or you can look at it in an adaptive way that would address our climate change issues, our housing issues, our economic development plan. It all fits. So I would encourage you to just try that on for size. You might not like how it fits, but just like going in a store, give it a whirl and see what you look like in the mirror with a sustainability framework under your analysis. So I think that's a point that I wanted to make. And climate protection, Fodor and Associates. And so, I think it's an interesting challenge that we want to involve and include and balance and resolve different interest. So that's going to be a challenge, and so it'll take goodwill and relationships to make that work.
Thank you, Fred. You had 6 seconds left.
Donate that to David.
Thank you. David Eicher, 1110 Lommel Court. I think it's important for the UGB renewal to go to the voters and not just let it expire or to allow it to be changed by the city council. I think it's something that's very important to the citizens of Sonoma and Sonoma Valley as a whole in preserving the agricultural feel, the rural feel that you have in Sonoma and the Sonoma Valley. And so not to, if something comes along that promises some big bucks to the city, the city council doesn't get a little foggy in the head and say, oh, well, yes, we need these, these few $1 million, so we're going to expand. Yeah, and you keep expanding it, then you have problems. You lose what we have. And one of the things that's in the current general plan is to encourage tourism. And however, what's happening there is, not only you talk about balance of the quality of life, but it is bringing in the low-paying jobs, the hospitality industry and the retail. And so you have more demand for housing because you have more workers, but they're low-paying, so they can't afford to live here. So, there's two aspects to it. One is the demand for the low-cost housing. If the workers can make more money, they can afford more. So, there's two ways to look at it. Not only expanding and allowing more of the low-cost housing, but also in looking at, well, what do we want as the economy to grow? We don't want to continue. I think it was, we were just reading that in the past few years, half of the new jobs within the county of Sonoma were in the hospitality, low-paying. And so that's a problem there. Anyway, I think I know it's a long task, and I hope we get to it soon because I know it's going to take a lot of work by a lot of people, and I'm looking forward to being involved. So thank you.
Thank you, David.
Yes, good evening, Chair Felder, commissioners and staff, members of the public. I'm Terry Shore. I'm the Regional Director for the North Bay for Greenbelt Alliance. And I'm also a 30 resident of Sonoma Valley outside the city limits, but I've been here a long time, almost as long as David Goodison. And I've been with Greenbelt Alliance for the past 3.5 years. Greenbelt Alliance is an environmental policy organization that works in the 9-county Bay Area to protect our green belts, but also to encourage the right growth in the right places. So we're kind of unique in that way. Greenbelt Alliance is probably best known for our at-risk report, which we do every 5 years, where we look at the whole Bay Area, including Sonoma County, and see how we've done protecting our open space and building in the right places. So I have a couple of copies of hard copies here that I'll distribute, and I also have a packet for you. So tonight I'm here to urge the Planning Commission and the city staff to begin the public process to renew the city's urban growth boundary with a vote of the people before it expires in December 2020. And that might seem a long time away, but as we heard from the presentation on the general plan update, in a way we're already behind. So it's very important to establish a parallel timeline for the urban growth boundary to go forward to make sure that the voters get to renew it in time. I won't have time in the 3 minutes to provide a lot of the information that I'd like to share with all of you. So I would like to request you consider Greenbelt Alliance maybe doing an informative presentation to the Planning Commission or as part of a work study session, because our organization has 50, 60 years experience with urban growth boundaries that I'd like to share with you. Personally, I've worked with 4 cities in the last couple of years, Cotati, Windsor, Novato, and Sebastopol, to renew their urban growth boundaries. They all did it with a vote of the people, and none of them except Cotati were in line to make it happen with the general plan update in EIR. The general plan gets late, And so the UGB went forward on its own, and I can tell you each of those. So in Sonoma, which the voters passed Measure S in 2000 with a 64% yes vote, so it was very well supported, and back then it was much more controversial. Now they're all getting renewed with the city councils without any changes to speak of. So we think that we'll probably have even a stronger vote this time around to maintain the urban growth boundary. Why renew it? The citizens of Sonoma strongly support the preservation of open space, agriculture, and a small-scale community with livable neighborhoods and an exceptionally fine quality of life. I think that came out of last year's, the last time pro argument. So housing, UGBs and urban growth boundaries have not caused the housing crunch. So that's about all I can say in 3 minutes, and I will present you with a packet, and I hope that we can continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Should I go this way, or? Yeah, there's one for each planning commissioner of the packets, and then really the
One last time. I actually came tonight to listen on this topic, but to speak in favor of the apartment project that got pulled off your agenda. I'm a business person. I've, been in this community now since '96 as a resident, but my ancestors go back. My great uncle had a resort up in Boise. I learned to ride a bicycle up here. I have a lot of affinity for this community. And we used to have a sense of balance in this community between the tourism-based economy and the residents. It seemed to me at least, that there was a flow. It doesn't feel like that's the case anymore. It feels like there's something broken between, just in the discussion tonight around the wine tasting application that you considered. And the fact that there was a split vote on that matter. So I'm looking forward to the general plan as hopefully a way for us to get past talking past one another about the future of this community and try to restore that balance. I know each one of you feels passionately about this community as I do. But we need to heal that in this community. That's one of the things we've done, I think, successfully for 50 or 100 years. And it's in jeopardy right now. And so as we go into this general plan, I hope we can all try and put aside our ideological frames and try and hear our neighbors and resolve the disputes we're in right now. So that's my comment tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Well, we've run out of public, so I assume we're all done with that. So let's bring it back to the commission. And if there's any burning thoughts in any of your minds, we can pursue it. But I think we've got work ahead of us, and we're not going to solve it tonight. So I would just say parting comments on this topic.
I would like to make a couple of comments if I can. One is that I believe strongly that this general plan update is going to take us a phenomenal amount of time and a lot of staff resources to do. And from my perspective, being kind of new on the premises here, I think it's largely more aimed at the development codes. I think the development codes really do need to be looked at very strongly. I think what we deal with here, okay, is struggling to try and make the development codes fit what it is that we're looking at. I don't think it's the general plan that we're looking at that has that. And so my concern is that, and I realize this, let me ask you a question if I can, David, all right? What's the drop dead line for timing from Office of Planning and Research to do this?
Well, we don't have a deadline from the Office of Planning and Research, but we do have basically a mandate or direction from the City Council to get on with it. And that's not to say that we can't also look at certain development code issues as well in the meantime, but we would just have to be selective.
Yes, okay. So basically, we could make amendments to the development code absent the general plan update.
Oh, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Mr. Jansen, with all respect to your comments, if I understand your emphasis, I've been on the commission for a year now, and one of my concerns is that the general plan really reflects the philosophical, cultural history and attitudes about the town, and sometimes I feel that that document isn't getting enough emphasis as it relates to the development code. And I'd like to make the point that development code is very important, but I would not want to defer concern for the general plan to the development code. The development code is, the more objective, quantitative element in what we do here, and I'm very interested in getting more teeth into the general plan and more substance and more input from the general plan into the application of the development code that happens here in the Planning Commission. Thank you.
Just a few things. I'm very excited we're starting on this process. When did we start the 2006 plan? 03, 04?
It was certainly before 03. It's probably in 02.
Okay, so we're looking at maybe a 4-year process. Okay, so hopefully we're all still working on it 4 years from now. That's certainly up for debate. I think a few things. One, I really support the UGB getting going on that as soon as possible. That was actually my first vote in a municipal election back in 2000 was for the UGB, and I was part of that 60% that supported that. And if we know Sonoma like we do, I assume it'll be renewed. And so the quicker we get going on that, the better. I think the point that was made by Ms. Shore from the Greenbelt Alliance is a lot of the data I've read is that is a myth, that the UGB doesn't have effects on housing prices. It has effect on potentially housing availability, but it all comes down to supply and demand. And if you look at demand for housing in Sonoma, not just within our town, but as a second home destination, as a retirement destination, et cetera, there is potentially, I don't want to say endless, but there is significant demand for Sonoma. And you can build all the housing you want, but until you build more housing that there is demand for, pricing is not going to get affected. And so, and I don't think we could build enough housing to start to affect pricing without changing the character of Sonoma. And so I don't think the housing crisis from a price perspective should be an argument when it comes to the UGB. It could be for availability. In terms of the Valley connection that was brought up as an issue, I think that's very important because I saw that they recently updated their specific plan. And when I think of housing demand, I think of economic units. And when I think of an economic unit, I think of Sonoma Valley, not just Sonoma City. And they are really upzoning the highway through Boy Springs and Fetters and all that. And we really need to have good relations and work in tandem on that because the city of Sonoma is not, in my view, going to be responsible for providing all the housing for Sonoma Valley as an economic unit, especially when the Springs Specific Plan is anticipating significant density increases along the highway. So we need to be, I think that's important. And ultimately I'm excited that we're moving forward on this. So I really appreciate this presentation, and my only regret is that you're not going to be here with us, David.
May I make another comment? Okay. I think that I agree almost 100% with Commissioner Barnett's comments, okay? I think the urban growth boundary is extraordinarily important to this community. I also think that while the general plan update may or may not be required, okay, it doesn't seem like there's a big push, okay, at this point. I think that it's very hard in a community, any community, to have a general plan update that looks at things in the abstract. I think it's hard for all of us as commissioners and as staff, okay? It's real tough to think about what could come about. Think about some of our zoning. It has so many multiple potential uses, okay, within the same zone. And that's why I feel strongly that a little bit of attention here on the development code is more pertinent to what's happening in Sonoma. However, that being said, I totally agree that the urban growth boundary is very important to be retained, or otherwise put to a vote or something if it has to be. I personally would love to see it just last forever, okay, but apparently that's not the case. But we have to think about all the time that everyone has to spend on this, okay? And general plan updates, I think, David, your estimate of 4 years is highly conservative. I think it will take a lot longer. And that means that a lot of time is spent by the staff, by the planning commission, by the city council, and the community at large in terms of doing something that is in the abstract. And you can't put it down as to what's really going to happen on any particular piece of property. And that's what we see here all the time.
You know, we're gonna do this for 5 or 6 years. You don't need 5 or 10 minutes from me right now.
I think that's where we're at. If no one has any burning, insightful thing to add, I think we will wind this agenda item up and move on to issues update.
Okay, issues update. We prepared a written issues update. It's at your place. I think that the only thing that I would add would be that this might be my last planning commission meeting, in which case I want to thank you all very much. You've been great to work with, and I really respect the intelligence and the energy and just the commitment and community spirit that brought each of you here. It's what makes Sonoma special, in my opinion. I won't be around for this upcoming general plan update, and I do have maybe a little bit of regret for that. I was hired in Sonoma as an intern to help with the 85 general plan update, but that's probably plenty, really. So, maybe it's just time that, you know, fresh ideas, fresh energy, never a bad thing. In terms of that process, that selection process is ongoing, and so the city manager has decided to bring in an interim planning director for a period of, you know, possibly up to 4 months or so. He is already working for the city on some special projects. His name is Jim Moore. He is got a fantastic education. He's got a great background, and he's just tremendously smart, and you're going to love him. He's going to be a great fit here, and you'll be meeting him soon. And so, again, thank you all very much.
Okay. Just leading off the comments from the Planning Commission, certainly, David, we owe you an awful lot for all of that you have done for the city and for us on the Planning Commission, so thank you very, very much. As I said when you announced your retirement, you're going to be sorely missed, but we wish you well, and we certainly appreciate all of your contributions to the city. Thank you. Let's look for a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.